Right now, decide to move one of your fingers. Don't do it yet. Just decide. Notice the exact moment you feel yourself choose. Got it? Now here's the unsettling part. Your brain made that decision before you did. Not a second before, not half a second, but long enough that scientists could watch it happen and tell you which choice you were about to make before you knew it yourself. This is the story of the experiment that broke free will. In 1983, a neuroscientist named Benjamin Libet, working at the University of California, San Francisco, designed a deceptively simple test. He wired volunteers up to an EEG machine, electrodes tracking the electrical activity inside their brains. He sat them in front of a clock with a dot sweeping around its face, faster than a second hand, fine enough to time events down to a fraction of a second. And he gave them one instruction. Whenever you feel the urge, flick your wrist. No pattern, no prompt. Just wait until you feel like doing it, then do it. And note exactly where the dot was on the clock the moment you felt the urge to move. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but Libet wasn't measuring the movement. He was measuring the half second before it. Every voluntary movement, it turns out, is preceded by a specific signature of brain activity called the readiness potential. Scientists had known about it since the 1960s. It's a slow buildup of electrical charge in the motor cortex, the region of your brain that plans and executes physical movement. For decades, everyone assumed the sequence went like this. You consciously decide to move. Your brain responds by generating the readiness potential, then your body moves. Decision first, brain activity second, action third. Simple. Intuitive. The story your own mind tells you every single day. Libet's data said otherwise. When he compared the timing of the readiness potential to the moment his subjects reported feeling the conscious urge to move, the readiness potential came first. Not by a little. On average, it appeared around 350 milliseconds before people said they felt the urge to act. Your brain wasn't responding to your decision. It was making the decision, and your conscious mind was finding out about it a third of a second later, then quietly rebranding it as your own idea. Let that sit for a second. A third of a second doesn't sound like much, but in the language of the brain, it's an eternity. It's enough time for an entire decision-making process to unfold in the dark, outside of anything you'd call you, before the version of you that feels like it's in charge even gets the memo. Libet published his results, and the scientific world did not take it quietly. Some researchers accused him of overturning centuries of philosophy with a wrist flick. Others tried to tear the experiment apart, pointing out that self-reported timing of an urge is messy, subjective, hard to pin down to the millisecond. Fair criticism. But then other labs started running their own versions of the test, with better tools, and the finding didn't go away. It got worse. In 2008, a team led by neuroscientist John-Dylan Haynes at the Max Planck Institute in Germany took Libet's basic idea and pushed it into an fMRI scanner, capable of watching blood flow across the entire brain, not just the motor cortex. Subjects were asked to freely decide at a moment of their choosing whether to press a button with their left hand or their right. Haynes' team wasn't just looking for a readiness potential a third of a second early. They were trying to see how far back the decision actually started. The results, published in Nature Neuroscience, were harder to dismiss than Libet's ever were. Haynes' team could predict which hand a person was going to choose, left or right, up to 7 seconds before the person consciously felt they had decided. 7 seconds, not milliseconds. Seconds. Patterns in the frontopolar cortex, a region tucked behind your forehead involved in planning and intention, were already leaning one way or the other, while the subject still believed the choice was wide open. Read that again. A machine watching your brain could tell you which button you were about to press before you knew you were about to press it. The feeling of, I am choosing right now, wasn't a lie exactly. It was more like a delayed broadcast. The decision had already aired. You were just watching the replay and calling it live. Here's where it gets stranger, and this is the part almost nobody talks about. Libet didn't walk away from his own data, thinking free will was dead. He noticed something in the numbers that later became just as famous as the original finding. Even though the readiness potential started before conscious awareness, there was still a narrow window, somewhere between 100 and 200 milliseconds, where the conscious mind could step in and cancel the action. Libet called it the veto. You might not consciously start the movement. But you can still stop it. He nicknamed this idea free won't. You may not be the author of the impulse, but you might still be the editor. Think about what that actually means. Every craving, every impulse, every half-formed urge to say something you shouldn't, or reach for something you know you shouldn't eat, or say yes to something you'll regret, maybe arriving in your conscious mind already built, already loaded, already aimed. The origin isn't you, not the you that feels like a narrator sitting behind your eyes. But somewhere in that tiny window before the action fires, there's still a hand on the brake. Scientists have spent the decades since arguing over how much that brake actually matters. If the decision to move was already forming 7 seconds earlier in Haynes' experiment, is a 100-millisecond veto really free will, or just the illusion of control bolted onto a process that was already finished? Philosophers call this compatibilism versus hard determinism, and neither side has definitively won. Some researchers argue Libet's setup was too artificial. Flicking a wrist whenever you feel like it isn't the same as deciding to change careers, end a relationship, or run into a burning building. Complex, high-stakes decisions might route through completely different circuitry, layered with memory, value, and reasoning that a simple motor task never touches. That critique is fair. Nobody has run a 7-second prediction experiment on someone deciding whether to marry their partner. Maybe some decisions really are made in the light, not the dark. But the uncomfortable core of the finding hasn't been erased. Something in you is choosing before the part of you that feels like you ever shows up to the meeting. Here's the thing about that gray marble. You're picturing right now 3 pounds of tissue sitting behind your eyes. It never stops running. Long before you feel a craving, a thought, an urge, a decision, your brain has already been processing signals your senses picked up seconds, minutes, sometimes years ago. What you experience as deciding might really just be your brain notifying head office, the conscious narrating part of your mind, that a decision has already been reached. The notification just happens to arrive dressed up as free choice, because that's the story your brain has always told you. And the story feels seamless because you've never once caught it lying. So what do you do with that? If the origin of your urges isn't fully yours to command, if the readiness potential is already building before you feel anything, then the old picture of a captain steering the ship from the very first moment starts to fall apart. But Libet's veto window suggests something else might be worth holding on to. Maybe you were never the author of every impulse that shows up in your head, but you might still be the last line of editing before it becomes a sentence in the world. The urge to snap at someone you love. The urge to check your phone one more time. The urge to quit the second things get hard. You may not get to choose whether that impulse arrives, but somewhere in that narrow window, on the other side of 1/3 of a second, you might still get to choose whether it becomes you. Your brain has been making decisions in the dark since before you were born. Quietly, efficiently, without asking permission. The question the science hasn't answered yet is how much of that dark room you'll ever actually get to see. But the one flicker of light Libet found, that tiny veto window, might be the closest thing to freedom your biology is willing to give you. Use it.